Have you ever wondered what it truly feels like when the world outside vanishes behind a wall of snow and steel? The sound you hear is not a storm. It is the sound of a city bell, ringing in a rhythm of warning. The air is cold, sharp, and smells of wood smoke and fear. If you're settling in for the night, wherever you are, I hope this story can be a peaceful companion. If you enjoy this journey, a like or subscription is always so appreciated. I'm always curious to know where you're all listening from. It's amazing to think of this community spread across the globe. Let me know in the comments what time it is and what you're doing to unwind. Welcome to Sleep and Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, in Bedtime History, we begin our story not with a battle, but with a sound, the groan of massive iron-bound hinges, and the definitive, thunderous boom of a city gate closing for what might be the last time. This is the last day of freedom, and it is not quiet. The sound is a cacophony. It is the rumble of countless wooden cartwheels grinding against ancient cobblestones. It is the shouting of men, the cries of children, and the lowing and bleating of livestock. The great city gate, the main artery of life and commerce, has become a bottleneck of desperation. From the surrounding lands, a tide of humanity is pouring in. These are the refugees. They are farmers, villagers, and tenants from the outlying estates. They are not warriors. They are families, their faces etched with the dust of the road and the terror of what they are fleeing. They bring with them what little they could. Carts are piled high with mismatched furniture, sacks of grain, and cages of chickens. These animals, confused and frightened, add their voices to the din, a strange, pastoral sound in a moment of crisis. The streets, built for merchants and processions, are now clogged. They are a river of people, animals, and possessions, all flowing in one direction. And as they look back, they see the smoke. It is a thick, acrid, and oily smoke. It stings the eyes and catches in the throat. This is not the enemy, not yet. This smoke is a deliberate act, a terrible, necessary sacrifice. The city's own defenders, the guard, have put the torch to the suburbs. They are burning the beautiful outlying manors, the humble cottages, and the small workshops that nestled just outside the walls. This is the scorched earth policy. It is a brutal calculation. Every building, every tree, every stack of firewood is potential cover for an enemy. It is a resource for their siege engines, and so it must all be destroyed. The city, in its first act of defense, is wounding itself. Inside the walls, a different kind of panic is unfolding. In the city's main market square, the air smells of baking bread, but this is not a comforting scent. It is the smell of fear. Bakers are firing their ovens, trying to bake every last sack of flour they have, knowing the price is about to spiral. Merchants, just hours ago, were selling their wares. Now, they are hoarders. They are barring the doors to their warehouses. They are calculating not what they can sell, but what they can keep. The price of essentials is no longer a matter of commerce. It is a matter of survival. A loaf of bread that cost a simple copper coin this morning now costs silver. A small bag of flour. It has doubled in price, and then doubled again. This frantic, last-minute trade is a symptom of a deeper social truth. The city is already dividing. The wealthy, with their deep cellars and private stores, are not in this line. They are at home, calmly taking inventory, locking their pantries, and perhaps sending a servant to buy up a few more barrels of salt at any cost. For the poor, for the refugees who have arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. There is only the growing, gnawing realization that they are trapped. They have fled the enemy in the fields, only to find a new kind of struggle inside the walls. The social divide, always present, has become a chasm. The wealthy will face the siege from behind their own private larders. The poor will face it together. And above it all, the sound of the bell continues. It is not a frantic, chaotic ringing. It is a specific rhythm, a tolling language that every citizen understands. This particular cadence does not mean fire. It does not mean all clear. This rhythm is the most dreadful of all. It means gates closing. It is a final warning. It is a countdown. The city guard is a whirlwind of strained authority. They are trying to perform a dozen tasks at once. They are stationed at the gate, forming a human wall, trying to manage the last torrent of refugees. They are screaming to be heard over the noise, pushing people and carts forward. Move, move. There is no more time. At the same time, other units of the guard are on the ramparts. They are not looking for an enemy. They are looking down. They are clearing the killing ground. This is the open space at the foot of the wall. They are tearing down the last few sheds the fire teams missed. They are felling the last lonely trees. This ground must be a clear, open field of fire. Amidst this chaos, there is one last desperate act of hope. The gates are pulled open just enough for a single rider. A horse, lathered in sweat, pushes through the crowd. This is the last messenger. He carries a leather satchel, holding urgent wax-sealed pleas for help. These letters are addressed to allied lords, to neighboring barons, or perhaps even to the distant king. He is the city's last word to the outside world. The crowd parts for him. They watch him gallop away, disappearing into the same smoke-filled twilight that the enemy will soon emerge from. The hopes of the entire city ride with him. The enemy, meanwhile, is doing their own work. The smoke from the suburbs is not the only smoke on the horizon. The besieging army is also scorching the earth as it advances. They are destroying farms, burning any villages the defenders missed, and seizing any livestock. Their goal is simple: isolate the city, turn it into a stone island, cut off from all sustenance. The countryside, once a place of life and bounty, is being systematically emptied. For the citizens, the psychological shift is the most jarring. This morning, they woke up and planned their day. A baker planned his loaves. A merchant planned his sales. A mother planned her family's meal. Now, as dusk falls, that world is gone. The first torches are being lit on the walls. The air is growing colder. The autumn chill, once pleasant, now feels like a threat. This surreal feeling, this sharp, sudden transition from a normal day to the first day of an indefinite prison sentence, is a heavy blow. It is a shared, city-wide sense of disbelief. Then it happens. The last refugee cart has cleared the gate. The guards put their shoulders to the massive wooden doors. The bell's rhythm changes. The shouting dies down. A new sound emerges. It is the groan of those massive, iron-bound hinges, a groan of finality. The doors meet with a thunderous boom that echoes through the streets. And then, a second sound. The metallic clang and rattle of the heavy iron portcullis dropping into its stone groove. The wooden bar, as thick as a man's chest, is dropped into its brackets. The gates are sealed. The city holds its collective breath. A profound silence falls, broken only by the wind. But outside, in the new darkness, a new city is about to be built. That first night, the watchmen on the ramparts see it. At first, it is just one small fire, then another and another. Within an hour, the darkness that surrounds the city is transformed. A necklace of fire blooms in the night. Thousands of enemy campfires ringing the city in a circle of light. It is a beautiful sight, and it is the most terrifying thing they have ever seen. It is a silent, illuminated promise of the enemy's numbers and their intent. When the first light of dawn breaks, the true nature of the siege becomes clear. The defenders had expected a chaotic mob, a horde of soldiers. They expected a quick, furious assault. They were wrong. What they see from the walls is not a charge, it is construction. The enemy is methodical, organized. The sound that drifts on the morning breeze is not the sound of war cries. It is the distant, rhythmic sound of 10,000 axes and hammers. The sound of felling trees. The sound of driving stakes into the earth. The enemy army is not just an army, it is an engineering corps, and they have begun their work. The first thing they build is a line of fortifications. This is the circumvallation. It is a wall, a ditch, and a wooden palisade facing the city. Its purpose is not to keep the world out. Its purpose is to keep the defenders in. It is the first bar of the cage. It is built just outside of crossbow range, and it is built with alarming speed. It is a clear message: you are not getting out. But then they begin a second line. This one is even more terrifying. Behind the first line of fortifications, they build another. This is the contravallation, and it faces away from the city. This second wall is not for the defenders. It is for the relief army, the one the city is desperately praying for. The enemy is so confident, so well prepared, that they are building a fortress to fight a war on two fronts. They are settling in, ready to simultaneously besiege the city and fight off any rescue attempt. This is a devastating blow to morale. These siege camps are not the temporary, muddy fields the defenders had imagined. They are, in effect, mobile cities. They have their own command structures, laid out in neat military grids. They have their own markets. Civilian merchants, known as sutlers, have arrived with the army, selling wine, food, and supplies to the soldiers. Blacksmiths are setting up forges. The sound of hammers on anvils joins the sound of axes on wood. This is not a temporary expedition. This is an occupation. And what are they doing with all that wood? The local forests, which yesterday were a source of hunting and timber for the city, are being systematically harvested. They are not building campfires. They are building machines of war on site, in full view of the defenders. Teams of engineers and master carpenters are laying the foundations for trebuchets. These are massive, counterweight siege engines, designed to hurl enormous stones. They are building catapults. They are building siege towers. These are wooden monsters, taller than the walls themselves, which will be rolled forward. The city watches, in silence, as the instruments of their destruction are assembled. Perhaps the most sinister work is the work they cannot see. Specialized units of miners, known as sappers, are already at work. They are not building, they are digging. They are starting tunnels, known as seeps, far out of sight. Their goal is to dig under the city walls, to collapse a tower, or to simply emerge, suddenly, in the middle of a street. The thought of this, of an enemy burrowing beneath their feet, is a new kind of psychological fear. The open ground between the city wall and the new enemy line, the circumvallation, becomes a desolate wasteland. This is the no man's land. It is the very same ground the defenders worked so hard to clear. Now it is a dead space, watched by 10,000 eyes. The defenders do not just sit and watch. It is not in their nature. They must disrupt this work. And so the first sallies begin. A small wooden gate in the city wall is flung open. 100 men, the bravest or the most foolish, charge out. They run across the killing ground. Their goal to set fire to a siege engine, to disrupt the diggers. These are not battles. They are desperate, bloody skirmishes. Most of the men who charge out do not come back. In a strange, formal pause to the work, an emissary is sent. A single rider, bearing the enemy's banner, approaches the gate. He stops just out of arrow range. He has a message from the besieging general. It is a final offer of surrender. The terms are read. Open your gates. Lay down your arms. Your lives will be spared. Your city will not be looted. The city council, the mayor, the bishop, they debate, but it is too soon. The hope of the last messenger, the hope of a relief army, is still too strong. The answer is a defiant no. The emissary wheels his horse and rides back to his lines. The next sound is the boom. The first ranging shot from a newly built trebuchet, a massive stone the size of a carriage, arcs through the sky. It crashes against the stone rampart. The wall shudders. It holds, but the message is clear. The time for talking is over. The enemy's banners are planted, defiant, just outside of crossbow range. The psychological impact is immense. The enemy is not a chaotic rabble. It is a patient, resourceful, and methodical machine. And yet, there is a strange, shared reality. The besieging army is also vulnerable. Those thousands of soldiers, huddling in their new camps, also feel the autumn chill. They too suffer from disease, dysentery, boredom. Their own supply lines are long. The siege is not just a test for the city, it is a race. It is a question of who can outlast the other, who will starve, or freeze, or sicken first. The physical walls are set. The city is an island in a sea of enemies. But the true, decisive enemy is not the army. It is an ally to them, and it is arriving on the wind. It begins in the night. It begins not as a storm, but as a quiet, ethereal change. The guards on the ramparts, their faces raw from the wind, look up. The air has changed. It is a sharp, biting, dry, cold, different from the damp chill of autumn. And then the first flakes. They are large and slow. They drift down, catching the light of the torches. By morning, the world is transformed. The city is covered in a thick white blanket. The first snow has fallen. It is hauntingly beautiful. The dark, ugly shapes of the siege engines in the enemy camp are now softened, draped in white. The grime and fear of the city streets are hidden beneath a layer of pure, clean snow. The cannons on the walls are capped in white, and the silence, the snow's most profound effect, is the silence. It muffles all sound. The distant, constant noise of the enemy camp, the axes, the hammers, the shouting is gone. The sounds of the city, the cartwheels, the cries are muffled. It is an eerie, surreal quiet. The world has been wrapped in cotton. For the soldiers on the walls, this snow is a blessing. They are cold, their feet are numb, but they are also relieved. The enemy's work has stopped. The ground is too soft, too muddy, too frozen to move heavy siege towers. The sappers, their tunnels now dangerously prone to collapse, have paused their digging. The snow has bought the city a reprieve. the war of swords and stone has been put on hold. But this blessing is a curse. The city's lifeblood is its river. The river turns the great watermills, and the watermills grind the city's grain. But as the cold deepens, the river begins to slow. Ice forms along the banks. And then, one morning, the familiar, rhythmic thwack-thwack of the mill wheel stops. The river is frozen. The mills are silent. The city's ability to make bread from its grain has been crippled. A new crisis is born, a fuel crisis. The cold is no longer just an inconvenience. It is a lethal enemy, second only to the army outside. The immediate, desperate need for warmth consumes the city. Every chimney in every house is in use. A thick, heavy pall of wood smoke and coal smoke hangs over the city. It is a constant, tangible smell. And with this demand, the siege prices begin. The laws of supply and demand become grotesquely clear. A single log of wood, which a month ago was nearly worthless, might now cost as much as a small house. The wealthy, who had the foresight to buy whole stacks of firewood, are warm. The poor, who lived day to day, are now making impossible choices. The city leadership is forced to act. This is the moment civilization begins to fray. The city council issues a decree. All private stores of grain and fuel are to be seized for the common good. Soldiers, who were once neighbors, go door to door. They force open the larders of the rich merchants. They seize the grain. They take the wood. In return, they issue bread cards, ration tickets. The city is now on a strict, measured allowance. On the ramparts, the plight of the sentries is extreme. They stand for hours, motionless, staring into the white landscape. The enemy is not shooting arrows, but the air itself is an attacker. Frostbite is the new, constant, lethal threat. Men return from their watch with blackened, dead fingers and toes. The crunch of a guard's boot on the fresh snow, echoing on the rampart, is one of the only sounds. Another, often overlooked, crisis is sanitation. The city is a complex, living system, and that system is now failing. The primitive pipes and aqueducts freeze. The latrines, dug for a city of 10,000, are now trying to serve 30,000, including the refugees. They overflow. The frozen ground makes digging new pits impossible. A new, awful smell begins to mingle with the wood smoke. The threat of disease, of dysentery, of plague, is now a greater danger than a trebuchet. In this new, quiet, frozen world, some people begin to write. A noblewoman, a merchant, a priest. They begin to keep a siege diary. They are not chronicling great battles. They are chronicling the small, slow decline, the price of a log, the taste of the rationed bread, the eerie silence of the snow. These diaries, kept in secret, will become a vital, heartbreaking resource for historians. They are the voice of the city. And so, the first deaths of the siege are recorded. They do not die from a blade. They do not die from a stone. An elderly woman is found in her attic room, frozen, her hands still clutching an empty woodbin. A refugee child, one of those who poured in on that last day, dies of exposure in a makeshift lean-to. The city has its first casualties, not in a battle, but in a war against the cold. The city is locked in ice. The enemy soldiers huddle in their own cold camps. The war of swords has paused, and the war of survival, of ingenuity, has begun, and it begins in the dark. With the official economy now reduced to a grim, government-controlled ration, a new one is born. It is not born in the market square. It is born in the frozen, dark alleyways. It is the shadow market. Here, the official ration cards are meaningless, and coin, the gold and silver of the old world, is becoming useless. What good is a gold coin if the man you are trading with has nothing to spend it on? You cannot eat gold. A new barter system emerges. The currency is survival. A silver locket, a family heirloom, is traded for a single withered potato. A heavy wool blanket is traded for a small bag of salt. People are, quite literally, trading their past for a few more days of a future. This is the source of the impossible moral dilemmas. A mother, her child coughing in the cold, looks at the one valuable thing she has left. A ring, a locket, a small, beautiful object from her old life. To keep it is to watch her child starve. To trade it is to give up a piece of her identity, her family, for a handful of barley. It is not really a choice. It is a transaction of desperation. And who are they trading with? The hoarders, the black marketeers, the men who, on that first day, did not just buy 1 barrel of flour, they bought 100. The men whose stashes were not found by the city guard. These men are now the new, grim aristocracy of the siege. They sit in their guarded cellars, on a fortune of food, and they name their price. The shadow market itself is a place of whispers. You can hear it before you see it. The sound of secretive, hushed haggling echoing in a frozen alley. The smell is strange. It is the acrid, smoky smell of unknown things being roasted or boiled. Things that, a month ago, would have been unthinkable. The city becomes quieter. The familiar sound of a barking dog vanishes. The stray cats that once roamed the alleys are gone. They have disappeared. They are sold in the shadow market as rabbit or mutton. It is a grim, unspoken truth. Everyone knows. No one speaks it aloud. A new profession, once scorned, suddenly becomes one of the most profitable in the city. The rat catcher. He is no longer a public servant, protecting the city from plague. He is a hunter. He is a purveyor of meat. He walks the frozen sewers and the dark cellars, and he is paid handsomely for his catch. This is also the birthplace of invented foods. The official bread ration is small, and it is getting strange. To make the flour last, the bakers are using fillers, sawdust, chaff, ground up straw. The bread is heavy, it is gritty, it is damp. The texture is awful, the taste is bitter. But it is bread, it is bulk, it fills a stomach for a little while. This is the first taste of the siege. The gnawing, profound hunger that drives a respectable citizen to seek out the shadow market, to trade a silver coin for a small, dirty sack. And what of the city guard? The men who are meant to uphold the law. They face their own dilemma. They know these markets exist. They patrol the alleys. But what do they do? If they crack down, if they arrest the hoarders and seize the food, they are simply enforcing the slow, fair starvation of the ration. If they let the market function, they are allowing the city's poor to be exploited. But they are also allowing them to survive, just barely. It is a moral compromise, a blind eye turned in the name of a desperate, shared survival. The most valuable currency in this new, dark economy is not food. It is rumors, a whisper. I heard a baker on the south side. He has real flour. They say the old tannery, they are boiling the leather. Scraps. I heard a man. He caught 3 rats. These whispers, these scraps of information, become the most valuable commodity in the city. The city has survived the initial shock. The gates are locked. The snows have fallen. But the winter is long, and the real test has just begun. What simple, everyday item, perhaps a spice or soap, do you think you would miss the most? Let us know in the comments as we settle in and explore how they learned to live without. They found calories in wallpaper and vitamins in the dark. The city's kitchens became strange laboratories. A new kind of science was being born. It was a science of pure necessity, of deconstruction and transformation. The art of the siege was not just about enduring hunger. It was about redefining food. In the cold, quiet mornings, the smell that filled the air was not the rich aroma of coffee. It was something sharper, more earthy and bitter. It was the smell of acorns roasting. This was the city's new coffee. But it was a long and patient process. First, the acorns had to be gathered, a difficult prize from frozen ground. Then, they had to be bleached. This was the crucial step. They were boiled for hours, the water turning a dark, murky brown with bitter tannins. That water was thrown out, and the acorns were boiled again and again. Only when the water ran clearer were they ready. They were dried by the weak fire, then roasted until they were dark and brittle. Finally, they were ground into a coarse powder. The resulting drink was bitter, yes. It held no caffeine, no familiar comfort, but it was hot. It was a ritual. It was a warm cup to hold in freezing hands, a small, defiant act of normalcy. And what of bread? The bakeries had long run out of flour, but human ingenuity found a substitute. It was a grim and shocking one: sawdust. This was not just any sawdust swept from a workshop floor. It was a specific, deliberate harvest. People turned to the trees that were not yet cut for fuel. The non-toxic trees, like birch or pine. They stripped the coarse outer bark, a difficult task with frozen fingers. They were seeking the thin, pale, life-giving layer beneath, the inner bark, the cambium. This layer, which carries the tree's own nutrients, was carefully scraped away. It was dried, slowly, over any available heat. Then it was pounded and ground, not into a fine flour, but into a heavy, fibrous meal. This was the sawdust of siege bread. When mixed with a little water and perhaps a handful of straw for bulk, it formed a heavy, dense loaf. The texture was nothing like bread. It was gritty, it was fibrous and tough. It tasted of the forest, of resin and wood, but it held calories, and calories were life. The search for sustenance turned inward, to the very fabric of the homes themselves. People began to look at their walls with new eyes. In rooms that were already being stripped of furniture for fuel, the wallpaper became the next resource. This was especially true of older, pre-modern paper. It was thick, made of rag paper, and crucially, it was hung with a simple wheat paste glue. This glue was the target. Families would peel back the stiff, curling sheets. They would boil them in their soup pots. The paper itself would slowly dissolve, but the wheat paste, the true prize, would cloud the water. It created a thin, starchy gruel. It was a lukewarm, nearly tasteless broth, a ghostly echo of the wheat it once was. The city was, quite literally, consuming itself. The desperation deepened. The search for gelatin, for any source of protein and fat, led to the last resort: leather, old boots, stiff and worn, leather belts, the harnesses from horses that had long since been eaten. These items were collected, cleaned as best as possible, and then boiled. They were boiled for hours and hours. The smell was thick, the salty, smoky scent of boiled hide. Slowly, agonizingly, the tough material would break down. It released what little gelatin it held, creating a thick, viscous base. This became the stock for a new kind of soup. A soup that tasted of salt and smoke, a strange and primal flavor. It was the taste of pure survival, extracted from the tools of a life that no longer existed. In some sieges, this grim inventory took on a terrible and public face. During the siege of Paris in 1870, the city's normal food supply chain was completely severed. The butcher shops, empty of beef and pork, turned to a new, exotic menu. The city zoo, once a place of wonder, became a final larder. The two beloved elephants, Castor and Pollux, were the first to go. They were butchered, and their meat sold at astronomical prices to the wealthy. Soon, the butchers were offering kangaroo, antelope, even camel. This was not a solution for the masses. It was a grim, desperate novelty for those who could afford it. But it sent a clear message. Nothing was sacred. Everything was a resource. Yet, amidst this darkness, there was breathtaking ingenuity. While some looked down, others looked up. On the frozen rooftops and in the small balconies, a new kind of agriculture was born. People filled wooden boxes with any earth they could find, and in this cold, thin soil they planted the hardiest, fastest-growing greens, mustard cress, kale, anything that could withstand the cold and provide a sliver of life. A small, precious patch of vibrant green against the snow and gray soot was a profound symbol of hope. And if the roofs were for greens, the cellars were for vitamins. In the dark, damp spaces beneath the city, another lost art was rediscovered, sprouting. People would take their last handfuls of lentils, beans, or wheat. They would soak them and keep them in damp, dark cellars. This was the city's secret weapon against a terrible siege disease, scurvy, the lack of vitamin C. A disease that haunted sailors on long voyages had come ashore. It attacked the cities, but these small, pale sprouts, grown in total darkness, were packed with the very vitamin needed to fight it. People were finding vitamins in the dark, a quiet miracle of biology. This resourcefulness extended to psychology. The citizens needed more than just calories. They needed the idea of food, the memory of it. And so, mock foods were created. When there was no chocolate, they roasted beans or chicory root, grinding it into a dark powder that at least looked the part. When there was no sausage, they took whatever scraps of meat they could find, even the unusual, and ground them together, seasoning them heavily. Mock sausage, mock chocolate. These were lies, but they were hopeful lies. They were an attempt to shape the terrible reality into a familiar form. It was a way to sit down to a meal, not just a pile of resources, and pretend, for a moment, that the world was still sane. The scarcity of fuel created one more strange and beautiful innovation: the community oven. No single family could afford the wood to heat their own oven for a single, pitiful loaf of sawdust bread. It was a waste. So, the community came together. The old baker's oven in the cellar of a building became a public utility. It was the one place that was always warm. Families from the entire block would bring their strange, desperate doughs. They would gather in the communal warmth, the air thick with the smell of baking. It was a moment of shared humanity, a ritual of resilience. Of course, the grim reality was never far away. The community oven stood in stark contrast to the unusual butchers. As the siege wore on, the unthinkable became the mundane. Shops opened that openly sold the city's scavengers. Rats and mice, cats and dogs. They were no longer hidden. They were sold at established prices, just like any other commodity. This was the final, grim marker of the siege kitchen. It was a place where all taboos had been burned away by the cold, and all that was left was the resourceful, desperate, and wondrous art of staying alive. But survival wasn't just about food, it was about warmth. The cold was an invader. It was a silent, patient enemy that slipped through every crack and settled deep into the bones. The hunt for fuel became the city's primary, all-consuming occupation. Life was stripped down to a single burning question: how to make fire. A grim hierarchy was established. First, the city's official wood rations were distributed. They vanished in days. Then, the public spaces were consumed. Trees that had lined the boulevards for a century were cut down. Park benches, fences, and public scaffolding were torn apart. Then, the scavengers turned to abandoned houses, ripping up floorboards and prying beams from the walls. Finally, the siege turned inward. The home began to eat itself. This was a time of heartbreaking choices. People looked at their own furniture, not with affection, but with a cold calculation of its worth as fuel. The sound of a wooden chair being broken apart became common. That sharp, splintering crack. A dresser, a wardrobe, a child's cradle. The most poignant sacrifice was often the piano, a symbol of culture, of art, of a peaceful life. It was now just a large wooden box, waiting to be broken and fed to the stove. The dilemma extended to the libraries. What is the value of a book in a freezing room? Citizens and librarians had to choose. They would often save the useful books, medical texts, engineering manuals, history, but the frivolous books, the poetry, the novels, the philosophy, were sacrificed. They burned culture to create warmth, a terrible, necessary transaction. The smoke that rose from the city's chimneys was acrid and unpleasant. It was the smell of green wood, wood that was not properly seasoned. It was the smell of varnish, of paint, and of paper. This desperate hunt for fuel created a new, terrible crime: the fuel thief. In a world where a pile of wood was the difference between life and death, stealing it from a neighbor was a profound betrayal. It was a crime punished severely, a sign that the bonds of community were fraying under the terrible cold. But as the city consumed itself, the landscape offered a new, dangerous gift. The premise of a frozen world was not just a hardship, it was an opportunity. A river that ran through the city, or the wide, defensive moat outside the walls, was no longer a barrier. It froze solid. It became a new geography, a hidden pathway. This slick, dark, reflective surface, seen under the light of a winter moon, was a place of both hope and terror. It was a way to smuggle goods. A brave soul could skate or crawl across the ice, pulling a sled of precious food or medicine. Secret messengers used this frozen highway, slipping past enemy sentries in the dead of night. History tells of the siege of Haarlem in 1572, where Dutch defenders on skates would dart out lightning fast to skirmish with the Spanish besiegers. It was a strange, surreal image of grace and warfare. But this pathway was also a trap. The ice could be thin, and more than that, it was a perfectly flat, open killing field. A full moon, which lit the way, also lit the target. A sniper's bullet, a distant shout, the crack of artillery. The river offered a path, but it demanded a heavy toll. The ice offered another, more practical resource: clean water. With the city's pipes frozen and wells often contaminated, the frozen river was a source of relatively pure water. Men were sent out with saws to harvest it. They cut great, heavy blocks of ice. This ice harvesting was dangerous work, exposing them to enemy fire, but they would haul the blocks back, a precious, frozen treasure. It then had to be melted, a process that cost precious fuel. It was a constant, difficult calculation. Fuel for water, or water for life. And the snow, the very symbol of the cold, was turned into a defense against it. People would pile snow against the outer walls of their houses. They packed it deep. It was a natural insulator, a blanket made from the enemy itself, trapping what little warmth the house contained. As the siege dragged on, a new kind of darkness fell. The city ran out of fat, no tallow for candles, no oil for lamps. The nights, already long in winter, became profound and absolute. This was the tallow crisis, and it led to one more piece of ingenuity. The Russian people would gather reeds from the frozen riverbanks. They would dip them in any available grease. A smear of bacon fat, a drip of fish oil, anything. The result was not a candle. It was a dim, smoky, sputtering thing. It gave off a flickering, weak orange light. The smell was acrid, but it was light. It was just enough to see the face of the person next to you, just enough to hold the total darkness at bay. Life was stripped to its barest essentials, food and warmth. Yet in this frozen, stark world, a complex society continued. Sickness and injury, they did not wait for the thaw. The ingenuity of the doctors was, perhaps, the most wondrous of all. With supply lines cut, the hospitals and pharmacies were empty. Medicine, as they knew it, was gone. So, they had to reinvent it. The city was fighting new enemies, the invisible siege diseases. Scurvy was the first, the result of a diet with no fresh food. The sprouting beans in the cellars were the only cure. Then came typhus. In the crowded, unwashed conditions, with no fuel to boil laundry, lice spread, and with them, the fever. It swept through the packed tenements and makeshift hospitals. And finally, dysentery. The breakdown of sanitation, the contaminated water from frozen, broken pipes. It was a devastating, dehydrating illness. To fight these and the wounds of war, the doctors turned to the earth. They rediscovered a lost art, herbalism. They sent people to gather willow bark from the same trees being stripped for food. They boiled it into an intensely bitter tea. It contained salicin, a natural pain reliever, the ancestor of aspirin. It was their only defense against fever. They used yarrow, a common weed, as an antiseptic. But the true wonder dressing was found in the bogs and marshes. Sphagnum moss, this humble bog moss, was a miracle. It was sterile, straight from the earth, and it was 20 times more absorbent than cotton. Nurses and doctors harvested it, dried it, and packed it into wounds. It was a clean, earthy-smelling, and incredibly effective bandage, a gift from the land when the factories were silent. When herbs and moss were not enough, they made their own antiseptics. They distilled spirits, a harsh, raw alcohol, from spoiled grain or rotting potatoes. It was not for drinking. It was for cleaning a wound, or the surgeon's knife. Lacking even that, they used a simple, stinging, saltwater brine. The landscape of medicine changed. The city's grandest buildings were converted. Churches, university halls, and large manors became siege hospitals. The sound in these halls was not of prayer or learning. It was the low moan of the sick, the cough of typhus. The beds were packed close together, a sea of suffering. The smell was overwhelming. It was the combined odor of unwashed bodies, of sickness, and the sharp, chemical smell of carbolic acid or brine. For the surgeon, the greatest enemy was the cold itself. frostbite. Men who stood on the walls for too long would come in with feet and hands frozen black. The surgeon's plight was to perform amputations. This was done with minimal anesthesia. Perhaps a large dose of that raw alcohol, perhaps a rag soaked in opium, if any was left. The sound was rhythmic and terrible. The grating of the surgeon's bone saw, a sound that echoed in the cold stone halls. The simplest tasks became vital. The constant, unending job of boiling water, all water, the water from the harvested ice, the water from the snow. It was the only defense against dysentery. It was a task that consumed vast amounts of precious fuel. The toll was not just physical. Doctors began to diagnose a siege madness, a profound, listless apathy, a lethargy from which people simply did not return. The mind was giving up, even when the body could have continued. And in the children, a quiet tragedy unfolded. The lack of sunlight, the poor diet. It led to rickets. Their bones, still growing, became soft and malformed. A generation was being marked by the siege. The final, somber task was burial. The ground was frozen iron. It was impossible to dig graves. And so, the dead were not buried. They were stored. Cellars and ice houses, empty of the food they once held, became ice morgues. The dead were wrapped in shrouds and laid in the freezing dark, perfectly preserved. They were waiting. The entire city was waiting, waiting for the spring, waiting for the ground to thaw, to finally accept its dead. The body was being mended with moss and ingenuity. But the mind, the human spirit, required a different kind of medicine. It needed information. It needed hope. In a world without modern media, information was a resource as precious as food. It was a weapon. It was a medicine. And the city became a place of whispers. The battle for information was fought on two fronts. The first was the official gazette. This was the voice of the governor, the command. It was printed on broadsheets, on whatever paper could be found, sometimes on the back of old wallpaper. The news it carried was propaganda. It was designed to keep morale high. A small skirmish on the walls became a glorious victory. The dwindling food stocks were stable and well managed. Losses were minimized, successes exaggerated. It was a necessary fiction. The second front was the enemy's propaganda. Arrows would fly over the walls, trailing leaflets. These small, fluttering pieces of paper landed in the snowy courtyards. They carried a different message, a promise of food, of warmth, of mercy. "Surrender," they whispered. "Your leaders are lying to you. We will feed you." This was the official war of words. But the real news traveled in the whisper networks. It started with a watchman on the wall. He would see a movement in the enemy trenches. He would tell the merchant he was billeted with. The merchant would tell his wife. His wife would tell the woman she waited in the bread line with. Each telling, the story would change. A few wagons become a vast supply train. A new cannon becomes an army of reinforcements. These whispers, passed in the profound hush of a cold room, felt more real, more true than the official gazette. This hunt for news created new specialists, listeners. These were men who would go out at night and lie on the frozen ground, pressing their ear to the earth. They would listen for the rumble of wagons, for the sound of digging. They would lie near the stone walls, straining to eavesdrop on the conversations of enemy sentries. It was espionage at its most elemental. And there were the heroes, the secret messengers. These were the men and women who would dare to leave the city. They would use the frozen river path, crawling on the ice. They would carry messages to allied armies, or to the outside world. and attempt the even more dangerous return journey. To speak the wrong news was a crime. Spreading defeatist rumors, even if they were true, was a threat to morale. It was an act of treason, punishable by imprisonment. The truth itself became forbidden. So, the city developed silent ways to talk. Coded messages passed in plain sight. Laundry hung on a line in a specific pattern. A series of chalk marks on a wall. A language of symbols that only the initiated could read. The most important figures in this whispering city were the siege diarists. These were the people who understood the importance of the moment. In freezing attic rooms, by the light of a sputtering rushlight, they wrote. They were the keepers of the forbidden news. They wrote down the real prices of food. They wrote about the sawdust bread, the cold, the fear, the rumors. The scratching of their secret pens on paper was an act of defiance. They were not writing for their neighbors. They were writing for history, for us. Sometimes the ingenuity of this information war reached astonishing heights. During the famous siege of Paris, the city was completely cut off, but they found a way to speak to the world. They used manned balloons. These great gas-filled orbs would rise from the center of the city, carrying mail, messengers, and politicians. They would fly up and over the enemy lines, a one-way trip to freedom. But how to get messages back in? The answer was the carrier pigeon. The balloons would carry the pigeons out. Once in friendly territory, the pigeons would be loaded with messages, microfilmed and reduced to tiny specks, and then they were released. They would fly back, guided by instinct, over the enemy and into the besieged city. A tiny, feathered thread of connection to the outside world. A small, fluttering sign that they were not truly alone. In a world with no internet, no radio, just whispers, imagine the power of a single, hopeful rumor. The city has learned to survive, but now it must learn to live. If you're still with me, I hope this story is bringing you some peace as we move toward the heart of the city's soul. Music and art kept the soul alive, a small fire against the cold. The siege was a physical prison, but the mind, the human spirit, refused to be locked down. It was in the darkest, coldest places that this spirit shone the brightest. The city's grand concert halls were silent. They were too large to heat, their windows too exposed to artillery. So, the art of the city went underground. It went into the cellars. Imagine a low, vaulted stone room. It smells of damp earth, of unwashed bodies, and the faint, oily scent of a single rushlight. The air is so cold that you can see your own breath. You can see the breath of everyone around you. A white mist rising from a crowd of people huddled together in blankets and rags. They are not just huddled for warmth. They are huddled for comfort, and they are all listening. In a cleared space at the front, a single soldier sits on an empty crate. He holds a violin. He begins to play. A single, clear note cuts through the damp. It is a sound of shocking, heartbreaking beauty. It is a sound from the before times, a familiar folk song, a piece of a symphony. For a few minutes, the hunger, the cold, the fear, they all recede. There is only the music. This was the impromptu concert, a vital ritual. A noblewoman who could sing, a merchant who could play the flute. They shared their gifts, and it was a gift of life. In other cellars, there were siege theaters. Soldiers and citizens, gaunt and weary, would put on plays. They did not stage grand tragedies. The city was living a tragedy. Instead, they performed comedies, satires. They mocked their own situation. They mocked the enemy. Laughter was a weapon. It was an act of defiance. This gallows humor was a vital psychological defense. To be able to laugh at the absurdity of eating sawdust bread, to make a joke about the price of a rat, it was to rob the despair of its power. The sound of shared, hushed laughter in a freezing room was a profound sign of life. Art was not just remembered, it was created. Siege poetry was written on scraps of paper. New siege songs were composed, songs of grim humor, of hope, of longing for a simple piece of bread. And the children, they too adapted. Their games, once innocent, became a reflection of the world. They played siege. One group would build a small fortress of snow and rubble. The other would pretend to attack it. They played hoarder, hiding pebbles or bits of wood from each other. They held pretend feasts, describing in great detail the food they wished they had. It was the only way they knew how to process the strange, cold world they lived in. People craved connection, a sense of a larger purpose. The churches, though unheated and dark, became central gathering points. They were not just for prayer, they were for community. They were places to hear the official news, to share the real, whispered news, to sit in silence with others, and to know that you were not alone in your suffering. The intellectual life of the city also refused to die. In the darkness of a university hall, a professor of philosophy might give a lecture to a small, huddled crowd. He was not paid. His students were starving, but it was an act of faith, a faith that a future existed where philosophy would matter again. It was a way to keep their minds active, to keep them from freezing with the cold. And the artists, they felt the drive to document. With fingers numb from the cold, they would sketch. They drew the gaunt faces of their fellow citizens. They drew the strange, beautiful, and terrible scenes of the frozen city. They were the diarists of the visual world, capturing the reality of the siege for history. This need for art as defiance is a timeless human story. We see it, most famously, in the modern siege of Leningrad. The composer, Dmitri Shostakovich, wrote his Seventh Symphony. A starving orchestra was assembled. Some were so weak they had to be carried to the performance. But they played. They played this thunderous, powerful work as an act of defiance, broadcasting it over loudspeakers toward the enemy lines. It was a statement. We are not just starving. We are not broken. We are a civilization. We are still here. That is the power of a shared song, a familiar play, a poem read aloud in a cold room. It reminds people that they are not just individuals fighting for scraps. They are a community. They share a culture, a history, a humanity. It was the food for the soul, and it was just as important as the bread for the body. But as the winter finally reached its deepest point, as the art in the dark burned its brightest, the first signs of a different, physical change began to appear. It did not begin with a shout or a cannon. It began with a sound, the quietest, most hopeful sound in the world. Drip, a single drop of water, falling from an icicle on an eave. Drip, a citizen, huddled by a frozen window, would hear it. They would stop. They would listen. Drip, drip. It was the sound of the thaw. The psychological impact was profound. It was a sudden, shocking, almost unbelievable spark of hope. The winter was not eternal. The cold, which had felt like a permanent, invading god, was mortal. It was beginning to retreat. Soon, the sound was everywhere, a steady, constant patter of melting snow. The city began to weep. The thaw brought new sensations. The air changed. It was no longer the sharp, dry cold that cracked the skin. It became a wet, damp cold. A cold that felt different, that felt temporary, and the smell. For months, the city had been locked in a scentless, frozen state. Now, the thaw released the smells of the earth, the first, rich, wet, earthy smell of damp soil. It was the most beautiful aroma in the world. But it was not the only smell. The thaw was a time of reckoning. It released all the frozen waste of a winter without sanitation. The smell of garbage, of refuse, of decay, rose with the smell of the earth, and the bodies, the dead, stored in the ice morgues of cellars and basements, were beginning to thaw. The city now had to face a new, urgent wave of disease. The thaw was not just a release, it was a new danger. On the river, the frozen highway, the sound was not a drip. It was a crack, a great groaning and splitting sound. As the ice sheet broke apart, the pathway was gone. The river was a river once more, a churning, angry flow of gray water and ice. This change brought a new set of calculations, a new duality of hope and fear. The hope was clear. If the city was thawing, so was the world outside. A relief army, an army that could not march in the deep snows of winter, could now be on its way. The mud would slow them, but they could move. And the enemy, the besieging army, was also suffering. They were camped in the open fields. The thaw, for them, meant a quagmire of mud. It meant their own cannons would sink. It meant disease would sweep through their camps. The thaw might be the one thing that could force them to leave. But the thaw also brought new, immediate threats. The sappers, the enemies, miners. For months, the iron-hard ground had been their enemy. Now it was soft. The defenders of the city began a new, terrifying vigil. Listening for the sound of digging, the sound of an enemy tunneling beneath their feet to collapse the walls. The mud, the no man's land between the city and the enemy lines, became an impassable swamp. It bogged down any potential sally by the defenders, but it also trapped the attackers. And then came the cruelest blow, the false spring. The dripping would last for days. Hope would rise. The first precious green shoots, the buds on a tree, might even appear. People would dare to believe, and then a new front would move in. The temperature would plummet, another hard freeze. This was, perhaps, the greatest psychological test of all. To have that hope, that physical proof of salvation, snatched away. It crushed morale more than any bombardment. It was the winter's final, spiteful act. But the real thaw always comes. The dripping would return. The ice would groan and break. The first small patches of black, bare ground would emerge from the white snow like islands of a new world. The world, frozen for so long, was beginning to move. And with that movement, with the roads clearing, came the final, desperate chapter of the siege. It began on the wall, a watchman scanning the horizon, his eyes raw from the wind. He had been staring at the same bleak, snowy hills for months. But today, something was different. It was a flicker of movement, not the familiar gray uniforms of the enemy patrols. Something else, a forest of new banners cresting the distant hill. He strained to see the color, and then he heard it. A sound carried on the damp spring air, a distant trumpet call. It was not the enemy's tune. It was a familiar tune, a friendly one. The cry went up. It echoed down the walls, into the streets. Relief, banners, an army. The city held its breath. People, too weak to run to the walls, simply stopped. They listened. And they heard it, the muffled, distant boom and crack of a battle being fought outside. a battle being fought for them. They were no longer the only actors in this play. They were the prize. The city, which had been the entire world, was now just a part of a larger story. The tension was unbearable. And then a new sight, smoke, but not from the city, and not from the new army, from the enemy's camp. The besieging army was burning its own siege engines. They were burning their huts, their supplies, the long, gray columns of soldiers. The men they had watched for so many months began a long, slow retreat. They were leaving. The reaction in the city was not a roar of triumph. It was a stunned, tearful silence. Many were simply too weak, too hollowed by hunger, to celebrate. It was a relief so profound, so total, that it was silent. It was the feeling of a body, tensed for a year, finally unclenching. Some of the city's own soldiers, gaunt and ghost-like in their tattered uniforms, had one last act of defiance. They sallied forth. They gathered the last of their strength, opened a side gate, and harassed the retreating enemy's rear guard. It was a symbolic gesture, a final, proud statement. Then came the true, symbolic moment, the opening of the main gates. For months they had been barred, barricaded with earth and stone. Now the people pulled the barricades away. With a great, groaning, creaking sound, the heavy wooden doors were opened outward. They were not being opened for a trickle of refugees, but for the world. The relief army marched in, and they were shocked. They were met by a population of skeletons. They saw the gaunt, ghost-like appearance of the survivors, the hollow eyes, the thin, papery skin. The soldiers of the relief force, healthy and strong, wept at the sight. There were emotional reunions. A citizen finding a brother in the ranks of the new army. A soldier finding his family, somehow, still alive. And then came the most important part of the relief, the first wagons. They were not carrying cannons or ammunition. They were carrying food. The first thing the survivors smelled was not gunpowder. It was the overwhelming, beautiful, life-giving smell of freshly baked bread. Wagons of it. Wagons of flour, of salted meat, of cheese. A survivor, stepping out of the shadows of the gate, felt the warm spring sunlight on his face for the first time. The long winter was over. The gates were open. The enemy was gone. The city and its people have endured. They have survived. And in doing so, revealed something profound about themselves. And so, our journey inside the frozen walls comes to a close. The thunder of cannons has faded, replaced by the sound of the thaw and the murmur of a city coming back to life. We've seen how a world turned inward can create its own light, finding warmth in shared stories and food in the very wood of their homes. This was the surprising reality. The siege was not just a story of horror. It was a crucible of innovation. It was a time when the normal rules of life were suspended and a new, strange, but functioning normal was born. The heroes of this story were not just the soldiers on the walls. They were the doctors, the parents, and the artisans, the women who managed the community ovens, the men who taught philosophy in the dark, the artists who sketched the gaunt faces. The key to survival was not individual strength. It was communal cooperation. The shared experiences, the whispered news, the cellar concerts. These were the bonds that held the city's soul together. In the end, the story of the frozen siege is a testament to the human spirit, its ability to create a vibrant, complex, and hopeful world, even in the heart of a frozen prison. We see the proof of this in the days after the gates opened. The first sound of a normal market, the murmur of haggling and conversation. A gaunt citizen, taking their first hesitant bite of real bread, a look of profound, quiet joy on their face. And in the no man's land, that field of mud and death, the first flowers of spring, the crocuses and the snowdrops, were pushing through the soil. Life, it turned out, was more resilient than iron. The deep, serene satisfaction of the thaw, the simple, profound joy of survival, had arrived. The greatest surprise is that in the heart of the most profound hardship, they found the deepest well of ingenuity and community. The main story ends here, but the echoes of that winter linger on. If you're still listening, I hope this story has been a peaceful companion for you tonight. Thank you for joining me. As our journey through the long, cold nights of history comes to a close, let us settle in. Let us find a comfortable, quiet place, far from the concerns of the day. Imagine a room, safe and warm. Perhaps you can feel the soft, steady glow of a single study lamp, its light falling across a heavy wooden desk. The world outside is muffled, distant. All that exists is this room, this moment, and the quiet exploration of an idea. This is a space for reflection. The air itself feels still, carrying only the faint, pleasant scent of old paper and leather bindings. We are surrounded by the stories of the past, but we are not in them. We are observers, here to understand the deep, lasting echoes of the siege. The battles are over. The snows have melted, but what remains? The physical walls may crumble, but the psychological walls, the ones built inside the mind, can last for a lifetime. This is the legacy we explore tonight. Let us gently turn the page and begin our final chapter. We begin with a concept that was forged in these very crucibles of suffering. It is a term we use today, often casually, but its origins are rooted in the profound, collective trauma of the frozen wall. It is the siege mentality. What is this? Truly, it is more than just a phrase. It is a collective state of mind. It is a psychological transformation that occurs when a community is isolated, surrounded, and under a constant existential threat. The world shrinks, becoming only what is inside the walls. Everything else, the entire world beyond that barrier, becomes the outside, the enemy. This is the first and most powerful change. A deep, intense polarization takes root. The us versus them mentality becomes the primary lens through which all life is viewed. There is no nuance. There is no neutral. There is only the in-group, those who share this suffering, and the out-group, the hostile force that inflicts it. The wall of stone and timber becomes a wall in the heart, and as the outside becomes more monstrous and singular, the inside becomes more intensely bonded. This is the strange paradox of the siege. It fosters an incredible, heightened sense of in-group loyalty. Neighbors who were strangers just weeks before, who may have distrusted one another, now become family. They are bound by a shared identity. This identity is one of endurance. They share the same meager rations, the same cold, the same fear. This shared suffering becomes a powerful social glue, forging an unbreakable communal bond. The survival of the individual becomes secondary to the survival of the group. A person's worth is measured by their contribution to this collective struggle. But this intense loyalty has a dark and fearful shadow. With it, a pervasive paranoia begins to creep through the city's narrow, cold streets. If we are all in this together, then any crack in our unity is a betrayal. Any sign of dissent is a threat to the survival of all. Suspicion of outsiders becomes absolute. But even more terrifying is the suspicion of traitors within. A hoarded crust of bread, a whispered complaint about the rations, a moment of despair. Any of these could be seen as evidence of a weak link, of someone who is not fully committed to the group's survival. In the desperate psychology of the siege, a complainer is not just tired. They are a potential deserter. A hoarder is not just selfish. They are a saboteur. The mind, trapped within the walls, begins to hunt for enemies on the inside as well as the out. This powerful, fear-based unity is a tool that leaders can and do use. A populace that is fractured by politics or class can be instantly unified by a common enemy. Leaders can harness this siege mentality to consolidate power and demand absolute obedience by constantly reinforcing the US versus them narrative. They can frame any disagreement as treason. This is not just a relic of medieval history. It is a powerful psychological tool used even in modern times to unify a populace, to justify hardship, and to silence dissent. The threat, whether real or manufactured, makes the leader's hand strong. The siege, in this way, becomes a state of political control as much as a military one. And what happens when the siege is finally broken? What happens when the gates are thrown open and the relief army arrives? The trauma does not simply evaporate with the morning fog. It leaves long-term effects, echoes that can last for generations. The most common of these is a deep, instinctual, hoarding behavior. Think of the stories of grandparents who lived through great wars or depressions, the ones who cannot bear to throw away a scrap of food, who carefully save pieces of string, who meticulously reuse every jar and box. This is not mere eccentricity. It is the echo of the siege. It is a learned, cellular memory from a time when waste was a sin, a time when a single potato or a few inches of candle wick was the difference between life and death. The mind, once forged in that scarcity, never truly forgets the fear of the empty pantry. There is another, more complex psychological echo. It is a variant of what we now call Stockholm Syndrome. In some long, drawn-out sieges, a strange, mutual respect could develop between the defenders and the besiegers. They were, after all, enduring the same harsh winter, separated by only a few hundred yards of frozen mud. We have accounts of soldiers shouting jests and insults back and forth, of brief, informal truces to collect the wounded. It was a kind of grim, professional courtesy. They recognized in their enemy the same human suffering they felt themselves. It was a fleeting, fragile connection, but it speaks to the mind's search for humanity, even in the most inhumane of circumstances. In the end, the siege redefines virtue itself. The highest values of the besieged community are no longer kindness, or creativity, or wealth. The new supreme virtues are loyalty and endurance, the ability to suffer without complaint, the strength to stand on the wall for one more night in one more blizzard, the refusal to give up even when all hope seems lost. This is the morality of the frozen wall. It is a harsh, unyielding code, but it is what allows the community to survive. Life is stripped down to its barest, most essential element, the will to continue. This mentality, once established, can become a kind of prison. The besieged mind develops a powerful confirmation bias. Every action from the outside world is interpreted as hostile, a peace offer. It must be a trick, a partial withdrawal of troops. It is surely a feint, a trap to lure the defenders out. The mind becomes locked in a cycle of suspicion. unable to accept any evidence that contradicts its worldview of us versus them. This is, perhaps, the saddest legacy of the siege. Long after the physical threat is gone, the psychological walls can remain. The community, defined for so long by its struggle and its isolation, may struggle to reintegrate with the outside world. They may remain insular, suspicious, and forever marked by the shared memory of their ordeal. The war ends, but in their minds, the siege never truly lifts. This mentality is a profound legacy of communal trauma, a scar on the collective soul. But as we sit here in the quiet, it is worth noting that from this same desperation, another, more positive legacy emerged. It is a legacy of invention, a testament to the incredible, stubborn creativity of the human mind. Let us now turn our thoughts to this ingenuity, to the surprising flashes of brilliance born from the darkest of times. When all traditional resources are cut off, the mind must find new paths. The siege, in its own way, was a powerful engine of innovation. The ersatz foods, the strange substitutions we have heard about, were more than just desperate measures. They were, in fact, the precursors to modern food science. When you cannot get flour, you must ask, what is flour? It is bulk, it is starch. And so, they found it in sawdust, in straw, in the dried pulp of trees. When coffee was gone, they found a similar, bitter warmth in roasted chicory root. These food extenders were the first, crude attempts at deconstructing food to its essential components. It was a grim sort of kitchen chemistry, born of an empty stomach. Perhaps the most romantic and striking invention came from the siege of Paris in 1870. The city was surrounded by the Prussian army, completely cut off. No letters, no news, no way in or out. And so, they looked to the sky. They used hot air balloons for the balloon post, the world's very first airmail service. Imagine the sight for the people of Paris. In the midst of their suffering, a great, colorful orb rising from the center of the city, carrying their messages, their hopes, and their defiance, floating silently over the heads of the enemy. It was a profound symbol of freedom, a message to the world that they were not yet broken. But this created a new problem. The balloons could get out, but they could not be steered back in. How, then, to get messages back into the besieged city? The answer was another marvel of ingenuity, the pigeon post, combined with the brand new technology of microfilm. A single carrier pigeon could not carry a bundle of letters, but it could carry a tiny, translucent piece of film. Photographers in the outside world would take thousands of letters and photograph them, shrinking them down to a microscopic size. A single pigeon, flying back into Paris, could carry a whole library of correspondence. It was a remarkable fusion of biology and technology, a high-tech communications network born from pure desperation. This need to siege-proof resources led to one of the most important inventions in our modern lives, the process of canning. The French Emperor, Napoleon, whose armies were essentially a city on the move, offered a massive prize to anyone who could find a way to preserve food for his soldiers. It was a man named Nicholas Appert who claimed the prize. He discovered that by boiling food, such as vegetables or meat, inside a sealed glass jar, he could prevent it from spoiling. The heat killed the bacteria, and the seal prevented any new bacteria from getting in. You can almost hear the quiet pop of that first sealed jar being opened months later, revealing perfectly preserved food. It was a revolution that would change how all of humanity eats. In a similar vein, the bouillon cube was invented. How do you make soup portable for a soldier on the march, or for a city with no fresh meat? You dehydrate it. You boil down the bones, the vegetables, and the meat for hours, or even days, until all the water is gone, leaving only a thick, solid paste. This portable soup was a soldier's companion, a small block of concentrated nutrition and, perhaps more importantly, flavor. In the dead of winter, a soldier could mix it with hot water and have, in an instant, the warm, savory comfort of a hearty broth. The smell of that simmering soup would have been a powerful reminder of home, a small comfort in a world of hardship. Sometimes the invention was not a new technology, but a new tradition. During the brutal siege of Leiden in 1574, the people were reduced to eating leather and leaves. When the city was finally liberated, the story goes that the starving citizens found a single large pot of stew left behind by the fleeing Spanish soldiers. It was a simple, hearty hodgepodge of carrots, onions, and whatever meat was available. It became known as hotspot, and to this day, it is a national dish in the Netherlands, eaten every year on the anniversary of the liberation. The invention was the meal itself, a taste of survival that became a powerful cultural symbol. The very act of siege and counter-siege drove engineering to new heights. The advanced techniques of sapping, or digging tunnels to get under a wall, and mining, using explosives to collapse it, required an incredible understanding of geology and physics. These military engineers, especially the great French engineer Vauban, were developing the core principles of modern civil engineering. The same mathematics used to calculate the angle of a tunnel to avoid collapse would one day be used to build subways, mines, and the foundations of skyscrapers. And what of Vauban himself? His greatest invention was not a weapon to win a siege, but an architectural design to prevent one. He looked at the tall, flat walls of medieval castles and saw them as giant, foolish targets for cannon fire. And so he designed the Star Fortress. These were low, sprawling, geometric marvels. They were built with angled bastions, or stars, so that there were no blind spots. Every inch of the fortress's perimeter could be covered by interlocking fields of fire. These intricate, precise architectural diagrams show a beautiful, deadly, mathematical elegance. They were so effective that they made the old storming tactics obsolete, forcing enemies into the long, slow, grinding sieges we have been exploring. Even money itself had to be reinvented. What happens in a city when gold and silver coins run out? When trade with the outside world is impossible, the city's commander would often create siege coins. This was an early form of emergency currency. He would take whatever metal was available, sometimes melting down church silver, or even using bits of lead or copper, and stamp it with a simple, crude design. This coin had no real intrinsic value. It was, in effect, a simple promise, a piece of metal that said, "The governor guarantees this is worth one loaf of bread." It was a fascinating, tangible symbol of the social contract, a form of money backed only by the desperate hope of a city's survival. Finally, the siege revolutionized communication. In the 1850s, during the siege of Lucknow in India, the defenders were trapped, but they had a new, almost magical tool, the telegraph. For the first time, a besieged city was not silent. We can imagine the quiet, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the telegraph key in a silent, barricaded room. With each tap, the defenders were sending messages to the outside world. They were coordinating the relief army, reporting on their dwindling supplies, and, most importantly, breaking the profound psychological isolation that was the besiegers' greatest weapon. They were no longer alone. These inventions, from the humble soup cube to the world's first airmail, changed the world. But just as powerful, and just as lasting, is the legacy of memory itself. How a city chooses to remember its ordeal, how it passes that story on, is an invention all its own. Let us now reflect on this memory. How do the walls, long after the soldiers are gone, continue to tell their story? Cities, like people, have memories. These memories are etched into their very stones, their street names, and their holidays. The great sieges are not forgotten. They are absorbed into the city's identity, becoming a central part of its story. In the Netherlands, the memory of their long struggle for independence is celebrated every year. On October 8th, the city of Alkmaar celebrates the Alkmaar onset, or the relief of Alkmaar. It is a major local holiday, a proud reminder that victory begins at Alkmaar. It is a day of processions and celebration, a city defining itself by its foundational moment of endurance. Even more famous is the Leiden's onset, the relief of Leiden, celebrated just a few days earlier on October 3rd. This memory is not just celebrated, it is tasted. On that day, the city government gives out free herring and white bread. This was the very first food brought in by the relief fleet that broke the long, terrible starvation. Imagine, for a moment, standing in a quiet crowd and being handed that simple meal. As you eat it, you are not just a modern citizen. You are participating in a direct, sensory communion with your ancestors. You are tasting the very flavor of liberation, the end of hunger. Not all memories are so joyous. Some, like the siege of Derry in Northern Ireland, are complex and contested. The annual ceremony of the shutting of the gates is a central part of the city's history. For one community, it is a powerful celebration of defiance and unwavering loyalty. For another, it is a painful symbol of division. It is a potent example of how the memory of a single event can be both a binding force and a deep, lasting barrier. Sometimes, the memory of a siege becomes a foundational myth for an entire nation. The story of the fortress of Masada in modern-day Israel, where Jewish defenders made their last stand against the Roman legions, has become a powerful symbol of national endurance. The fortress is a site of pilgrimage. The story is one of ultimate sacrifice and the refusal to submit. The memory of that ancient siege is used to forge a modern ethos of resilience. Other memorials are defined not by triumph, but by the sheer, staggering scale of loss. The 900 days of the siege of Lenin-Pavelgrad, the memory there is not of a single heroic charge, but of a long, dark, frozen endurance. The Piskayovskoy Memorial Cemetery is a vast, silent, and overwhelming monument. It is not a grand statue of a general. It is a quiet, haunting landscape of endless, simple grave mounds. The memorial is the absence, the silence of the place. The sheer number of names speaks more loudly than any triumphal arch. It is a place of profound, quiet respect, a testament to the millions who endured the unendurable. In more recent times, we find new and powerful ways to remember. In Sarajevo, a city that was besieged in the 1990s, the scars of the war are still visible. The craters left in the pavement by mortar shells became a kind of canvas. Instead of simply paving over these wounds, artists filled them with a bright red resin. They are known as the Sarajevo roses. They are beautiful and they are terrible. They transform a random scar of violence into a deliberate act of remembrance, a flower of blood blooming from the gray concrete. They force the passerby to stop, to see, and to remember. You can see this memory in smaller, quieter details all across old cities. You might see a siege cannonball still lodged in the wall of a church. Instead of removing it, the citizens chose to mount it there, to frame it. It is a badge of honor. It is a silent, defiant statement. We were struck, but we did not fall. We are still here. This memory is also kept alive in living traditions. The processions and reenactments of a siege's relief are often still led by the city's ancient guilds. It is the bakers, the blacksmiths, the weavers, all marching in their traditional dress. It is a powerful reminder of a time when the city was a small, interconnected world. A time when those very guilds were the ones who manned the walls, who put out the fires, and who organized the rationing. It reinforces the deep civic bonds of the community. And, of course, the memory is preserved in the very map of the city. We walk through it every day. Defenders Square, Relief Street, Barricade Plaza. These are not just names, they are stories. The city map itself is a history book with the memory of the siege written in asphalt and street signs, spoken aloud every day, even if we no longer think of the meaning. But all these public memories, the holidays, the statues, the street names, are built from a foundation of thousands of private ones. They are built from the stories passed down in families, the oral histories that keep the feeling of the siege alive. The story of a great-grandmother who survived on potato peels, the quiet pride in an ancestor who survived the Great Siege. These public memories are built from thousands of private ones, often preserved in archives, in the quiet, fragile pages of old diaries. And so, as we settle deeper, let us return to our quiet room. The fireplace crackles gently, its warm light flickering on the spines of the books that line the walls. We feel the weight of a warm, heavy blanket. Let us reach for one of these old volumes, here in the Scribe's archives. The binding is old leather, soft and worn. The pages are dry, and as we turn one, it makes a soft, papery sound in the stillness. These are the voices from the ice, the whispers of those who were there. Let us listen to them for a moment as we drift. Here is a small, paraphrased entry on a scrap of paper from the siege of Paris. A note from the butcher. A rat is now to francs. My neighbor's cat, 20 francs. We bought the rat. We joked that it tasted like pork. We did not laugh for very long. We turned the page. A single line from a diary kept in Leiden. Today, I traded my last silver locket. I traded it for one single, small onion. I held it in my hands for an hour before I could eat it. I wept as I ate it. I have never, in all my life, tasted such sweetness. Another page. A soldier's log from a long, forgotten siege in the English Civil War. The guns have been quiet for 2 days. The snow has muffled the entire world. It is a profound, heavy silence. It is more frightening than the cannons. A white, frozen, endless truce. Here, a baker's journal from the 900 days of Leningrad. The recipe today, 10% rye flour, 90% processed cellulose, sawdust. It is not bread. It is bread only in its shape. But the people line up for it in the cold, and they are grateful for it. It is warm. We turn the page again. A simple note from a farmer trapped in a walled town. The ice on the river began to crack this morning. The sound was like distant thunder. It is not just the ice that is breaking. It is the blockade. It is the sound of hope. The thaw has come. Another entry from a citizen's diary. We burned the last kitchen chair tonight. It felt like a crime. I kept thinking of all the meals we shared around it. To burn something so useful, so good. But the children are warm. For the first time in weeks, they are sleeping peacefully by the fire. It was a good trade. Here, a page from a woman's journal. Another rumor of a relief army. They say it is only 2 days' march. My heart aches with this hope. It is a heavier, sharper burden than the hunger. To hope again, and to be disappointed again. That is the true, final agony of the siege. We turn the page and find a musician's story. We gathered in the cellar, 20 of us. It was damp and so cold we could see our breath. But Pierre had his violin. He played for hours, his fingers blue. The music, it did not feed us. It did not warm our bodies. But it reminded us that we are still human, that beauty still exists, even here. A young guard's first entry on the first day of a siege. I saw them from the north wall at dawn. It is not an army. It is a sea. It is a forest of steel and black banners that stretches to the edge of the world. God help us all. And then this, the final page of a small, worn book. There are no dates. There are no long reflections, just 6 simple words, scrawled in a shaky but joyous hand. The bells are ringing. The gates are open. We are free. These quiet voices, drifting to us from the past, remind us that history is not just about dates and battles, but about the feel of a cold room, the taste of strange food, and the sound of a violin in a dark cellar. The walls that held them prisoner also held their stories, which, in the quiet of the night, they now pass on to us. I hope this reflection has brought you some peace. Welcome to this final, quiet chapter of our journey. There is no more story to tell. The great, overarching narrative is complete. Now is a time for simple, calm reflection. This is a quiet archive, a place for us to explore a few of the more famous sieges from our history, not as dramatic tales, but as simple, factual chronicles. The pace here will be our slowest and calmest yet. This is bonus content designed for the passive listener, for the mind that is ready to drift. There is no need to follow a complex plot. There is only the gentle, peaceful presentation of facts. Let us settle in. Let the sounds of the world fade away and simply ... be. We begin our chronicles with one of the most profound and sobering sieges of the modern age. We travel to the 20th century, to the city of Leningrad. This city, known today as St. Petersburg, was the subject of a siege that began in 1941. It was an event that would last for 872 days. This is a span of time that is difficult to grasp. It is not just a long winter. It is 2 full years, and then another half a year on top of that. 3 winters, 3 springs, 3 summers, all spent inside a ring of steel. It remains one of the longest and most destructive sieges in all of human history, a dark testament to the endurance of a city. For the nearly 3 million civilians trapped inside, cutoff was almost total. But there was one single, fragile lifeline. This was the road of life. It was not a road of stone or asphalt. It was a route driven across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, a vast inland sea of ice. Imagine a great, white, endless expanse, flat and frozen, stretching to the horizon. Across this surface, trucks would crawl, day and night, bringing in supplies. The ice would sometimes crack, The trucks were under constant threat of attack, but they continued to run, a thin, vital thread of survival in the frozen landscape. The supplies they brought were painfully small. The daily bread ration is the most haunting symbol of the siege. At its lowest point, during the brutal winter of 1941, the ration for a single person was just 125 grams. Imagine holding this in your hand. It is a small, dense, heavy weight, and it was not bread as we know it. The flour was mixed with extenders, with sawdust, with cellulose, with anything to create bulk. It was a food of pure, grim necessity, designed only to keep a human body functioning for one more day. And yet, in the midst of this starvation, the city's spirit held on. A most remarkable event took place. The composer Dmitri Shostakovich had written his Symphony No. 7, the Leningrad Symphony. A score was flown into the besieged city. The radio orchestra was assembled. Many of the musicians were weak from hunger. They were given extra rations to have the strength to play. And in the middle of the blockade, the symphony was performed. It was broadcast over the radio, a faint, distant sound of defiant, classical music, a message to the world, and to themselves, that culture and beauty had not yet been starved to death. This protection of culture took other, quieter forms. The city was home to the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry. This was, and is, one of the world's most important seed banks. It held a priceless, irreplaceable collection of seeds from all over the globe. As the siege tightened, the scientists at the institute faced a terrible choice. They were starving, the city was starving, and they were surrounded by tons of edible seeds, grains, and potatoes. But they knew that this collection was the future of agriculture. They knew it was a treasure for all of humanity, and so they locked the doors. They guarded the collection from rats and from the hungry population. They sat in their offices, surrounded by food, and slowly starved to death. They chose to save the future of others at the cost of their own present. It is a story of quiet, academic heroism that is almost beyond comprehension. The history of this time is also preserved in small, personal ways. The diary of Tanya Savichava, a young girl, is one of the most powerful. It is not a long book. It is a small, simple notebook. In it, she did not write her thoughts or feelings. She simply recorded, with stark, final simplicity, the deaths of her family members, one by one. Each page is a name, a date, and a time. It is the story of an entire family vanishing. The backdrop to all of this was the winter. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was one of the coldest on record. The temperatures plunged to unimaginable lows. The city was not just starving, it was freezing. Water pipes burst. There was no fuel for heating. People huddled in their apartments, burning their furniture, their books, anything to create a small flame. The feeling of extreme, biting cold, a cold that seeps through stone walls and into the very bones, was a constant, daily torment, as powerful as the hunger. In the midst of this cold and silence, the city's radio broadcast a single, steady sound. It was a metronome, a slow, steady tick-tock, tick-tock, that played in a quiet, cold room and was sent out over the airwaves. When the shelling was light, the sound was slow. When the shelling was heavy, it was faster. But it was always there. It was a sound that let the isolated, freezing people in their dark apartments know that the heart of the city was still beating, that the city and its radio station was still alive. The city also tried to protect its physical self. Leningrad was a place of great beauty, of golden spires and grand palaces. These shining landmarks were easy targets for bombers. And so a massive effort was undertaken to camouflage them. The famous golden spire of the Admiralty, a symbol of the city, was painstakingly painted a dull battleship gray. It was an act of preservation, a way of hiding the city's beauty, to save it for the future. The road of life across Lake Ladoga was not just for trucks. As the ice grew thick, a new, ingenious solution was found to evacuate the civilians. Ice trams were set up. A railway line was laid on the ice, and trams, powered by overhead cables, would carry people across the frozen lake. It was a strange, surreal sight. A city tram gliding silently across a vast white wasteland, carrying the most vulnerable to safety. It was another testament to the desperate, stubborn ingenuity of the siege. From the ice of 20th century Russia, our thoughts now travel far back in time. We move from the snow to the sand to the hot, dry wind of a desert fortress. We are at Masada. This siege took place in the year 73 or 74 AD. It was the final event of the First Jewish-Roman War. The location itself is a character in the story. Masada is a high, isolated rock plateau, rising thousands of feet above the barren Judean desert. The fortress on its flat top was originally built by Herod the Great. It was a magnificent and seemingly an impregnable stronghold. The besiegers were the Romans, the masters of siege warfare. They were represented by the Legio ex Fretensis, the 10th Legion of the Strait. This was a hardened, professional, and endlessly patient army. They arrived at the base of the fortress, looked up, and began their methodical, unstoppable work. The defenders were a small, determined group of Jewish zealots, known as the Sicarii, according to the historian Josephus, our only source for this event. There were 960 people in the fortress. This number included men, women, and children. They were the last, defiant pocket of resistance against the total power of Rome. The most famous and astounding feature of this siege is the ramp. The Romans, faced with a sheer cliff, decided to build a mountain of their own. Against the western face of the plateau, the Roman soldiers and their slaves began to build a massive earthwork ramp. We can almost hear the grinding sound of millions of stones being moved, of earth being piled up day after day, week after week, under the hot desert sun. It was an act of overwhelming, colossal engineering. When the ramp was finally high enough, the Romans pushed a great siege tower up its slope. This was not a simple wooden tower. It was said to be 100 feet tall, clad in iron to protect it from fire, and inside its armored head it carried a massive battering ram. This tower was rolled up the ramp until it was level with the fortress walls, a mobile, monstrous piece of war technology. The walls of Masada themselves were an invention. It was a casemate wall. This means it was actually two parallel walls, with a space in between that was divided into rooms. The defenders, seeing the Romans approach, had filled this space with earth and timber. This created a soft, absorbent barrier that the battering ram struggled to break. This fortress, in the middle of a barren desert, was surprisingly well provisioned. Herod the Great had designed it as a royal refuge. He had engineered a series of massive, rock-cut cisterns. These dark, cool, underground caverns could hold millions of gallons of water, channeled from rare flash floods. The air in these cisterns would have been cool and damp, a stark contrast to the burning heat outside. Not only did the defenders have water, they also had food. Herod had filled massive storehouses with grain, with olive oil, and with wine. The ancient, dry smell of these stored goods would have filled the air. Because of the dry desert climate, the provisions had remained perfectly preserved for decades. The Sicarii, upon arriving, found a fortress that was ready for a long, long siege. The end came when the Romans, using the ram, finally managed to breach the outer stone wall. They then encountered the inner, soft wall of earth and wood. They set it on fire. The flames, fanned by the wind, consumed the last line of defense. The Romans had broken through. This entire detailed account comes to us from one man. The Jewish Roman historian Flavius Josephus recorded these events. He was not present at the siege itself, but he claims to have interviewed survivors. Without his work, the Jewish War, this epic story of engineering and endurance, would be lost to history. From a desert mountain, we now travel to the flat, wet lowlands of the Netherlands. Our next chronicle is the water siege of Leiden, which took place in 1574. This siege was part of the 80 Years' War, the Dutch struggle for independence from Spain. The city of Leiden, a key Dutch stronghold, was completely surrounded by the powerful professional Spanish army. The city began to starve, and it seemed that all was lost. The Dutch rebels, known as the sea beggars, or Zuizen, were skilled sailors and fierce fighters, but they could not break the siege on land. They were a navy, and the Spanish army was on dry ground, and so their leader, William of Orange, proposed a radical, desperate plan. He decided to intentionally break the dikes that held back the North Sea. He would flood his own country. The dikes were broken, and slowly the ocean water began to creep inland. It submerged the farmlands, the roads, the villages. The sound of gentle, lapping water would have been heard in places it had never been before, in a farmer's field or at the base of a windmill. The smell of the sea, of salt and mud, was carried far inland. This intentional flood allowed the sea beggars to sail their flat-bottomed boats over the newly formed inland sea. Imagine the sight. Shipmasts moving slowly through the tops of flooded apple orchards. The fleet sailed, quite literally, over the submerged land, fighting the Spanish in a series of amphibious battles, getting ever closer to the starving city. The story of the liberation is one of legend. When the Spanish army finally fled from the rising waters, the first Dutch troops into the abandoned Spanish camp supposedly found a single pot of stew still warm. It was a hodgepodge of carrots, onions, and parsnips. This hutspot, as it came to be known, is still a celebratory dish in the Netherlands. A warm, comforting smell of a simple root vegetable stew. The first food brought in by the relief fleet, however, was herring and white bread. For the starving citizens, this simple, salty, sharp-flavored fish and the soft, pure white bread was a miracle. This, too, is still part of the Leiden's onset celebration. Every year, on October 3rd, the city of Leiden hands out free herring and white bread, a direct, edible link to their deliverance. The city's endurance was rewarded in a unique way. William of Orange, as a reward to the city for its heroic resistance, offered to found Leiden University. It is now one of the most respected universities in Europe. It stands as a testament not to a battle, but to the endurance of a city's citizens. During the siege, communication was vital. The city and the relief fleet exchanged messages using carrier pigeons. These birds would fly over the Spanish lines, carrying tiny, rolled-up notes. One of these pigeons, who famously carried a message of impending relief, is still preserved and on display in a museum in Leiden, a small, feathered hero of the siege. The siege was not just a story of hunger, it was also a story of disease. The plague, that ancient scourge, ravaged the city's weakened, crowded population. Thousands died from the sickness, as well as from the starvation. It was a battle on two fronts, against the Spanish outside the walls and against the disease within. The plan to flood the country was not an immediate success. After breaking the dikes, the Dutch had to wait anxiously. The water was not deep enough for their ships. They needed a strong westerly wind, a gale or storm, to push the seawater from the ocean further inland, to raise the water level high enough for the fleet to sail all the way to the city walls. This waiting, with salvation so close, was a final, agonizing test of their endurance. Finally, we will look at a more modern siege, one that took place in the famed City of Light. This is the Siege of Paris. In 1870, this siege was part of the Franco-Prussian War. The new, unified German armies, under Prussian leadership, surrounded the city of Paris. They brought with them new, modern weapons, long-range Krupp cannons. These were not the old trebuchet. These were modern artillery pieces that could sit miles away and shell the city. A distant, dull thud followed by a terrifying, whistling sound. The Parisians, trapped, turned to invention. To communicate with the outside world, they built 66 hot air balloons. This was the balloon post. These colorful orbs would lift silently from snowy city squares, often at night, carrying mail, politicians, and desperate messages, floating over the heads of the Prussian army. The balloons, however, could not be steered back in. This led to the pigeon post. Pigeons were carried out of the city on the balloons. Once the balloons had landed safely outside the siege lines, the pigeons would be released, carrying messages back to Paris. These were not just simple letters. The messages were first printed, then photographically shrunk onto tiny, translucent pieces of microfilm, a brand new technology. A single pigeon could carry thousands of messages. The siege is perhaps most famous for its culinary desperation. Paris, the gastronomic capital of the world, was starving. The city's zoos were emptied. Citizens who were used to fine dining were now eating exotic and then common animals. The two beloved elephants of the city zoo, named Castor and Pollux, were famously butchered and sold. A shop called the Boucherie Anglaise, or English Butcher, became famous for selling these exotic meats. They sold camel, antelope, and kangaroo from the zoo. As the siege wore on, they sold dog, cat, and rat. There are surviving menus from fine dining restaurants showing a cold, elegant, but profoundly hungry city where consommé of elephant was served on fine china. And the hissing of gas lamps on the dark, elegant streets illuminated a city of starvation. When the siege finally ended, it did not end in liberation, but in a complicated defeat. The French government, which was outside Paris, signed an armistice with the Prussians. The besieged Parisians, who had endured so much, saw this as a profound betrayal. This sense of betrayal and the hardships of the siege led directly to a revolutionary uprising after the siege was over. The Paris Commune, a radical socialist government, took control of the city. The chaos born from the siege continued to burn. The bread in Paris, like in Leningrad, tells a story. As wheat ran out, the beautiful Parisian bread was replaced by a dark, heavy loaf made of oats and rice, a grim, gritty substitute for the food that was a symbol of the city's culture. The bombardment of the city itself was a new, frightening aspect of this siege. The Prussians did not just want to starve the city, they wanted to terrorize it. The long-range cannons shelled residential neighborhoods, a new tactic of modern warfare that targeted the morale of the civilians as much as the military. The final, sad postscript of this siege came during the Commune that followed. The Tuileries Palace, a symbol of the old royal and imperial government, was set on fire by the communards. It was a sign of the deep, chaotic anger that had been born from the months of suffering, starvation, and betrayal, from the snows of Leningrad to the canals of Leiden. From the ramparts of our imagined Altenburg to the skies of Paris. The story of the siege is, at its heart, a story of human endurance. It is a quiet testament to our ability to find light in the deepest darkness and to build a community in the most profound isolation. Thank you for joining me, your sleeping scribe, on this journey tonight. I hope it has brought you peace, relaxation, and perhaps a little bit of wonder. If you've enjoyed our time together, please consider subscribing and feel free to leave any thoughts or suggestions in the comments. I read them all. For now, may your night be calm and your sleep be deep. Good night.